There are now just under 70 days to go until Ontarians head to the polls. Kathleen Wynne will be campaigning to make sure her party stays in power. She's our guest on Your Morning this morning. Good to have you here.
Thanks, Anne-Marie. Thank you.
All right, let's take a look at some of those big promises that were announced yesterday. Some of them we knew in the days leading up to. The big one, of course, that everyone seems to be talking about is this licensed childcare. Now, your government announced it as free and free pharmacare. As we know, nothing is really ever free. These are taxpayer dollars. I know for me, I mean, I may not be running a government, but I run a household budget. If I'm going to promise a big trip, like we're going to Disneyland, that means that we're going to have to pull back in other places to be able to afford something big like that. What are you going to have to pull back on to be able to pay for this?
Well, what we've done is we have put in place a budget that responds to concerns that people have brought to us. People are anxious about finding childcare. They're anxious about finding care for their loved ones, whether they're elderly or little kids. And people are having trouble paying for prescription medication. Those are things that we have responded to. And what we've said, in order to do those things, in order to put those supports in place, we are going to run a deficit for a period of time. We've balanced the budget this year. We worked hard to do that. But right now, people are living in an anxious time, and they're saying, we actually need more support. So spreading those costs over a period of time is what we're going to do.
More money being spent into the system is good come election time, but what does it do for the health of the province 6 years down the road?
Well, you know, I know spending is one way of looking at it, and of course we're spending money on people and helping them, but they're also investments. These are investments in a future economy, because our advantage is our people. If we make sure that everyone is at their best, then that actually pays a return in the future. And so making an investment in people today, and you know, there are young families who will decide that they can have another child. There are young women who will think, I can have a family and still go back to work because we're putting this child care in place. And you know, when we brought in full-day kindergarten, Anne-Marie, you remember that. You remember when we brought in full-day kindergarten, there were lots of people who said, we can't afford this, it's too much, why would we do this? And the reality is that thousands of families across the province are saving $6,000 a year, and kids are getting a great start in full-day kindergarten. That's the kind of investment that we're talking about.
Taxes are another way that we're going to have to pay for some of this. And while taxes are going to go down for a segment of the population, they are going to increase for another. And there are people who say, look, I'm being taxed higher at the federal level. If I go with this budget, if the Wynne Liberals get back into power, I'm going to be taxed again at the provincial level. At some point, I need to keep some of my money.
So let's just look at what's really happening. 83% of people will see their taxes go down, or there will be no change. The very highest income earners will see a small increase, because what we're doing is treating high income the same way we treat low income. So it's a fairness issue. And in terms of business taxes, we're closing some loopholes, actually, that we're allowing big businesses and banks not to pay as much, and we're complying with federal changes. So there are some small changes, and we acknowledge that. But overall, the vast majority of people will either see no change, or their taxes will go down, and they will see that their money is being put to work to provide for care that they need. You know, we didn't pull these initiatives out of the blue. We didn't say, oh, well, you know, let's just dream up some things that people want. We listened to families who are looking for mental health care for their teenager. We listened to families who say, you know, I've got parents who are in their 90s and we're looking for more care for them. And we listened to hospitals that said, we need more investment in order to be able to serve people. So those are the investments that we're making in response to the concerns that people have brought to us.
One of the areas, and this is an area you know very well, you were a school board trustee, is in education. And one of those areas you would have heard a lot of complaints about is people are frustrated. There is crowding in our schools. There are kids maxed out in portables. The system needs more money to be able to expand. We've asked both the NDP leader and the Progressive Conservative leader about possibly amalgamating the school boards so that you have one school board doing one job as opposed to a public and the Catholic school board. Is that something you would consider as a cost savings? Maybe put some of that money saved back into the education system?
Well, first of all, we are putting more money into education. Special education is one of the areas that needs more support, and we've heard that clearly from teachers and from parents. in terms of amalgamating the school boards, we're not looking at doing that. But what we are doing is we're requiring school boards to work together. And the savings, the dollar savings, really come from that kind of collaboration. So if you look at the work we're doing on community hubs, to require, Catholic board, public board, French board, English board to work together, to share space, to share services, that kind of coordination is actually where the savings can be found.
But what about parents who say to you in rural schools, our schools are closing, or parents in suburban areas like mine where our school is 3 years old, we're maxed out at portables already?
Well, but that's, if you look at the rural example, that's exactly where those boards need to work together. Your example of the suburban board, that may not actually, having one school board actually wouldn't solve that problem. You'd still have the same number of kids, and what we need to do there is make sure we build the new schools, which is why there's $19 billion in place to actually continue to build and renovate schools.
Part of this budget, there's a chunk of people who are sort of stuck in the middle. So people whose kids aren't in university yet, but too old to take advantage of daycare. Or even on the special needs side, what about the families whose kids at 18 opt out of a large chunk of their funding, but they're waiting for that passport funding to kick in? There's a huge backlog for them. What about those families?
You're talking about families with kids with disabilities.
That's right.
Yeah. So we've recognized that, and that's one of the responses. That's one of the things we've responded to in this budget, because I've heard from a lot of parents who are aging and who have aging adult children,
yeah,
and they're very worried about those supports. So we're actually putting money in this budget to provide more supports for the Passport, as you say, the Passport program, which allows families to buy those supports. But we're also putting in place money that will go into families' hands, and they will have choice about the kinds of programs that they can select.
When you go door to door, not only are people going to ask you about the promises, but they're going to ask you about the scandals, because the scandals, when you're taking a look at gas plants, when you're taking a look at the sale of Hydro One, even the sex ed curriculum, people say scandals cost money. So what is your response to them at the door? How are you going to convince them that, even though you had a majority for 4 years, you could have put this kind of money into place in the past and it didn't happen? How are you going to answer for that and the scandals? What do you say to change their mind?
Yeah, so those are two different things. I mean, in terms of the work that we've been doing, this budget builds on work we've already put in place. So, we already have put free tuition in place for young people. We dealt with retirement security because people were concerned about that. So we've already built a foundation. And so in response to a question about why are you doing this now and you didn't do it before, I will be able to lay out the changes that we've already made. I'm in politics to work to put supports in place for people that they need and solve problems. I think that's what government exists to do. In terms of the sale of Hydro One, that's about building transit. And so we're sitting here and you can see the transit go by. I mean, the reality is that building roads and bridges and transit was necessary, and that was why we broadened the ownership of Hydro One. We've talked about gas plants, and we've got clean energy in this province. We made decisions,
but it cost us a lot of money to get there.
It did, and we've talked a lot about that, and I've talked about why we made those decisions, and that there are some decisions that should have been made differently. So each one of those situations we will deal with differently. I will deal with them at the door and have repeatedly. The reality is right now, people are feeling very anxious about their future. They want to know that government is going to be there to work with them and to help them solve problems. And that, from my perspective, is exactly what government exists to do, to do the things, work with people to do the things they can't do by themselves.
It'll be interesting election this time
around. It will
around.
be, absolutely.
Thanks for being here this morning.
Thanks a lot.